Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 55 of TheKillFile. I'm so glad that you guys are back for another case today. Before we jump into today's case, just a few items of business. First, don't forget to check out the website at TheKillFile.com. You can submit a case that you want me to look into, or you can check out the merch shop for some true crime items that you will love. If you're interested in supporting TheKillFile, please take a second to rate, review, or subscribe wherever you listen, which will help boost TheKillFile on the searches for true crime podcasts so that we can get more listeners. Also, please tell a friend to join us and listen in and or follow TheKillFile on social media and share a post or two to help spread the word. I am very grateful when my listeners help me out with getting the word out there, and for those of you who already do or have done this, thank you so very much. You have no idea what it means to me to have some support on this journey, and for the effort that you guys have put in to do that for me is really something special, so thank you for that. Lastly, the bonus content will be rolling out this fall, something called the Hidden Files, where you can pay a few bucks a month and get some bonus episodes about things like natural disasters, crazy assassination stories, and I'm hoping to get enough listeners to write in their own true crime stories so that I can compile them into a couple of episodes for us to hear about what people have gone through. So if you know someone, even if they aren't a true crime fan, that has gone through something worth sharing, please encourage them to tell you the story or allow you to email it in or have them email it in at thekillfilepodcast@gmail. And of course, anyone can stay anonymous. I'm looking for anything from maybe a murder that happened in your town where you grew up that you remember. Maybe your mom was a witness to a bank robbery. Maybe your cousin dated a guy who ended up killing someone. Anything that you think could be worth sharing here on the bonus content under a category called Listener Files, don't be afraid to write in. It doesn't have to be long and it doesn't have to be about murder. Just anything related to true crime will do. Anyways, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today's case is someone that is often referred to as the serial killer that you have never heard about. Today, we are going to cover the case of Edward Wayne Edwards. Trigger warnings for today are going to be talks of suicide, rape, and murder. Here we go. We are going to journey back to 1933, where the Great Depression was still ongoing. Construction of the Golden Gate Bridge was commencing, FDR was inaugurated, the very first drive-in movie theater opened, and towards the end of the year, Prohibition ended with the approval of the 21st Amendment. This is also the year that Edward Wayne Edwards was born with the name Charles Wayne Murray on June 14th of the same year, 1933. Edwards was born in Akron, Ohio, to mother Lillian Cecilia Myers. One source would say that Lillian had actually given birth in 1931 to a baby who would only survive for 5 months. In a book written by Edwards called Metamorphosis of a Criminal, which, by the way, is like a $700 book now, I was able to find an excerpt from it in another book called It's Me, Edward Wayne Edwards, the Serial Killer You Had Never Heard Of, where Edwards talks a little bit about his mother. Edwards would say that not only was he told that his mother was his aunt, but that in December of 1935, his mother would sadly shoot herself in the stomach in what Edwards claimed was really a cry for help. Unfortunately, his mother would die just a few days later from sepsis. Many sources would say that his mother had committed suicide in front of Edwards, so I'm not really sure if he was there when she shot herself or what, but if that's true, then Edwards would have been just 4 years old when he would have witnessed this. He then spoke of the fact that he was adopted by a couple named Mary Ethel and Fred Edwards, but sadly, Mary, his adopted mother, would end up paralyzed and had to be bedridden for 7 years. He also said his adopted father was an abusive drunk who would beat Mary in her bed, which, if that's true, is absolutely awful for Edwards to have to see as a child and witness. He has now basically lost 2 mothers, and this is when his maternal grandmother would be the only family he really ever knew, with no siblings and never knowing his father. Edwards would speak to the fact that when he was 7 years old, his grandmother had quote-unquote given up on him and sent him to a Catholic orphanage, where he would say he was emotionally and physically abused. He would speak to the fact that he had a bedwetting problem, and one particular nun was dead set on breaking Edwards and kicking his bedwetting habit. Edwards would say he was the youngest in what he called a reformatory school, and that the older kids had taken Edwards and tied him to a tree where they all proceeded to kick him, and this was all allegedly in an effort to get him to stop wetting the bed. This is when Edwards would say that his hatred for the one particular nun, Sister Agnes Maria, grew so much that not even the reformatory school could control or handle him. He then went on to say that he had attempted to escape so many different times that eventually the orphanage called his grandmother and asked her to pick Edwards up. Edwards then claimed that when he was leaving, Sister Agnes Maria seemed to disapprove and then asked him what he was going to be when he grew up. And he replied, quote, "I'm going to be a crook, and I'm going to be a good one," end quote. Edwards then said that he would start public school when he was returned to his grandmother's home. He would say that he spent all of his time scheming on how to be a good criminal, and he knew this was one way to get recognition and for people to remember who he was. This idea seemed really important to Edwards, the thought of pulling off a huge crime and then standing in the crowd listening to people talk about the horrible things that happened, and not knowing that the man who committed the crimes was right next to them. This reminds me of another serial killer that we have covered where he went to the bar across the street from his first victim, a young girl, to listen to how horrified people were, and he loved it. I can't remember his name at the moment, but I do remember the story. Edwards would say that in the beginning of the year 1948, he would be sent to a school called Philadelphia Protectory, which of course he hated and resented even having to be there, but he would learn from the school. He also claimed to have had learned many criminal things that would help him later on, like how to hotwire a car, how to jimmy open windows and doors, and even how to set off fire alarms without being caught. In 1952, Edwards would be sent for 2 years to another reformatory after he was caught for stealing cars. The timeline of events here is a little murky, as different sources have different dates, but basically, at some point while being in and out of trouble for all of his teenage years, Edwards would volunteer to be in the Marines to get himself out of trouble. But after boot camp, or basic training, as some of us know it as, he was too young to be sent overseas, and this made him feel some type of way, and he would end up going AWOL. AWOL, for anyone who isn't familiar, just means the person went quote-unquote absent without leave, which is the acronym for AWOL. So basically, they're gone without permission. Edwards then headed back to Akron, Ohio, until he was finally caught for going back. This is when the Marines would dishonorably discharge him with no criminal charges, though. Edwards really seems like someone who could just not be controlled or contained, and wanted to be famous for his criminal activity. He was in and out of jails and facilities most of his youth, his adolescent years, and throughout his 20s, and even some of his 30s. He was definitely a career criminal. During one of the times that Edwards was busted, and this was around the age of 22 to 25 years old, there would be an evaluation of his mental state, and this is according to the book It's Me, mentioned before. According to the evaluation of Edwards, he did not seem depressed, but allegedly had a history of suicide ideation or gestures, which the evaluator called, quote, no more than suicidal ideation theatrics, end quote. The evaluator also commented on the fact that Edwards may feel neglected, sorry for himself, and discriminated against. The evaluator also felt that the story that Edwards was telling could be exaggerated for the gain of sympathy from others. I feel like we all know people who pull this kind of crap on a regular basis, right? It's the worst. The emotional manipulation is gross. I mean, let's be honest, we probably have all done this before in our own lives, and maybe it was a time that we needed that extra care or that love or attention, but usually this is like in our youth, and it isn't like a personality characteristic that we end up having our whole lives. In April of 1952, Edwards had again stolen a car and then impersonated a Marine, which he would be charged with and sent to a federal reformatory in Chillicothe. After being released, he would head back to Akron again, and then he was busted for burglary. He was being held on some charges for burglary that had caught up to him in Portland, Oregon, where he began committing more armed robberies, which again he would be busted for. He didn't seem to be a very good criminal, if you ask me. During one stint that he had in prison, it was said that there was a prison riot, which Edwards did not participate in, And because of this, he was actually given 5 years probation instead of finishing out his current sentence. During his 20s and 30s, while still pulling crimes off and also being caught, Edwards would also have some odd jobs, one of which was selling vacuum cleaners. Because Edward had escaped from jail in 1955 and had been out meandering across the country, and one source would say that he had been robbing gas stations to gain the money in order to travel, and with this, Edwards refused to wear a mask because he wanted to be famous. But in 1961, Edwards was actually placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, which is kind of a big deal, and holy shit. Edwards would then be returned to prison in Leavenworth, and finally paroled in 1967. Okay, so I think we get the picture of a troubled young man, which probably had some personality disorders, to say the least, but who had also claimed to be abused as a young man and then lived the life of crime and running from the law. Edwards had married his first wife, Marlene, before he went back to prison in Leavenworth and during the stint. Edwards would claim to have met a prison guard who he claimed had turned his life around completely. When Edwards was paroled from Pennsylvania's Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, and this was in 1967, Edwards then became an inspirational speaker and was remarried. Not only did Edwards become a motivational speaker, and this would be on prison reform and criminal rehabilitation, but he was also getting regular profiles in magazines and newspapers. People wanted to know about the man who claimed to have such a life of crime and then suddenly had stopped. Edwards was a guest on a TV show that I had never heard of, but I guess it was a game show called To Tell the Truth, and this was in 1972. He also wrote the book that I spoke about earlier, The Metamorphosis of a Criminal. This would give him an almost overnight success for his autobiography. Edwards and his wife Kay had 5 children together in a seemingly normal-ish sort of life. His daughter, who would later become very important later on, named April, would speak to the fact that her father was either very kind and loving or was very abusive in physical and emotional ways. When he was kind, there were memories for April of grand holidays, and even said that her father would play hide and seek in the dark with his children for fun. April would comment that the people in the community liked Edwards, which kind of bothered her, seemingly because things that were happening behind closed doors. I personally know this feeling very well. It always bothered me that someone in my life was such a good manipulator, making people feel sorry for him and putting on this show that he was someone that he was not, and no one even knew what he was really like. It's a really horrible feeling of injustice and helplessness, feeling like if the truth came out, people may not believe someone that's seemingly so nice could be a monster inside. I can't even imagine how confusing and hard this would be if it was your father. The family was living in an area called Doylestown, Ohio, in an older home that Edwards was determined to fix up. April would share that she remembers detectives, FBI, and police often being in her home as her father had become an informant of sorts and would gain information that helped the authorities. The information that Edwards gave did help to solve cases and get arrests, which can be dangerous if someone were to find out. One night, their home would burn down in an act of arson, seemingly someone who maybe didn't like that Edwards had helped the police. The arson was never solved. This is when the family would have to move in order to protect their children, as they were under the assumption that someone was after Edwards and that someone wanted to hurt him or his family. It was common for the Edwards family to move or relocate about every 6 months to a year, wanting to stay safe from the men who were looking for Edwards. All of the children were told that it was important to keep their new locations a secret because of whoever was out to hurt their family for whatever knowledge that Edwards had. That was so the bad men or the group of people couldn't find them. April remembers another time that they had been living in Ohio, and this is while Edwards was building his family their second home. She distinctly remembers there being a young man who had helped her dad with the house, and suddenly something had happened to that young man. He was no longer around. Not long after, Edwards would sell this home unfinished, and the family had to pack up and move again. This time, they were headed to Florida, and again, April would say this was in the middle of the night. In the year of 1980, April would say she was almost 11 years old at the time when her father would wake up the entire house and told all of his kids and wife to start packing. They had been living in Watertown, Wisconsin, and this is where the family had been living for about a year. April remembers her father coming home looking rough with like a cut on his nose, and again, the family would disappear in the middle of the night. This time, the family would head to Pennsylvania. The family had relocated to a place called Slippery Rock, where they had settled down a bit. Sadly, one night in 1982, when Kay was recovering from some sort of injury in the hospital, Edwards had taken his kids on a little camping trip, and while the family was away from the home, their family home was again burned to the ground. The next day, investigators would come out and find out not only was this an act of arson, but they would also figure out exactly who had done this. Edwards had 3 sons, and all of them little kids. They all came forward to confess that Edwards had enticed them to burn down their family home for the insurance money. Edwards, however, would tell the police that he actually did it to protect his family, and that the bad men who were after him and his family had indeed found out where they were living. Edwards said he wanted to take off and escape the danger of these men, but he didn't have the money to leave. Edwards would then be arrested for the arson and sentenced to 2 years in a Pennsylvania prison. Now, Edwards would get out of prison, and this is when April decides to graduate, get a job, and get out of her house, which she did. This is around 1987, leaving Edwards to take care of the 4 kids that were still left with their mother and father. As said before, Edwards had a kind and compassionate side to himself that did come through. This is about the time that a young man named Danny Glockner would come hanging around Edwards' home, and he kind of sort of took him under his wing. Danny is a teenager at the time who goes to school with the Edwards children and has sadly spent most of his life in foster care, which we all know can be brutal and tough for kids. It was believed that Edwards took Danny in because he himself had sort of the same childhood with seemingly no one who cared too much about him. I guess this went as far as Danny wanting to be adopted by Edwards, but the judge had told him that he was actually too old to be adopted by him. However, he could change his name to Danny Boy Edwards. I'm not sure why Danny Boy, but that is how his name is written. When Danny Boy had finished high school, it was actually Edwards who had encouraged Danny Boy to join the military, thinking that it would be a good step towards some sort of path for his life. Unfortunately, just before Danny Boy was about to be deployed overseas, he injured his ankle, to the point that he was actually going to be medically discharged from the military, which was a major blow for Danny Boy. In fact, Danny went AWOL 2 days before he was supposed to be discharged from the military. Back home, his family and friends were searching for him with no luck. He was just gone. A year later, there was some hunters who had been walking behind a cemetery, and they had come upon a shallow grave. Authorities would see that this body was very decomposed, and a week after finding the body, the coroner was able to identify the remains to having been Danny Boy Edwards. The cause of death would be determined as a gunshot wound, particularly from a shotgun that was in the back of his head. After Edwards learns about this news of his foster son, he loses his shit and is an apparent wreck, offering his services in any way possible to figure out who had done this. April would comment on the episode of People Magazine Investigates that she felt that her father was completely obsessed with the murder of Danny Boy, and actually he went up and asked different people at Danny's funeral who they thought could have done this and what they thought could have happened. The authorities worked on the case, but it would go cold. Fast forward a few years when all of the Edwards children had grown up and were sitting together eating dinner. Maybe at like a gathering, or maybe the kids were just getting together to eat, but somehow they all got onto the subject of Danny Boy's murder. This is when, between the Edwards children, they had figured out that the reason that their mother was in the hospital back in 1982 from her injury was because Edwards had actually stabbed his own wife. This is when April would say that she had learned that her 3 brothers had eaten this bag of chips, and when Edwards came home, he wanted to eat those chips, but of course they were gone. This is when Edwards flew off the handle at Kay and was screaming at her while she was trying to calm him down. Over this fucking bag of chips, he stabbed her. I guess April didn't know that until they were all together that night talking about the incident. She said she was completely shocked. This is when April would start to wonder what else could be lurking in their childhoods, and maybe things weren't always as they seemed. When they started talking about always being on the run when they were younger, all of the adult children were speaking to the fact of, was it really that they were on the run because Edward had snitched on someone who was after them, or could it possibly be because their father had a dark side that was capable of committing heinous acts. This is when April really started to put pieces together and started to really focus on the fact of, could her father be a murderer? She becomes obsessed with the idea and starts an investigation of her own. April would now begin to retrace their family moves and looking for crimes or murders of where they were living at the time when she runs into a dead end, a complete dead end. However, one night in 2009, April would run into something that piqued her interest in Wisconsin. In 2007, a cold case investigation would resurface and would be tested for DNA with the new forensics that were available. The underwear from a crime scene in Wisconsin would be tested from the female victim and would be found to contain semen. When April had started reading about these cold cases that received money to be reinvestigated, and the Sweetheart murders had come around, she had seen pictures of the Concord house, which would unlock a memory with a bone-chilling jolt. In Jefferson County, Wisconsin, there was a place called the Concord house, which was sort of a reception hall for the county, which resided around 85,000 people or so not really huge. On August 9th, 1980, there were a couple of weddings happening that evening at the Concord house. At one reception, there was a couple very much in love, a young man named Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, who were both 19 years old and had been high school sweethearts. The couple left the wedding reception arm in arm, but the couple would never make it home. The next day, Tim's father saw his car in the Concord parking lot and his wallet was inside, showing that it seemingly never left the reception area. This is when the search for Tim and Kelly and interviews would commence. There would be placed a $10,000 reward in the case. It would also be figured out that the couple had left the reception at about 10:30 p.m. and seemingly just vanished, completely and without a trace. About 3 miles from the Concord house, about 5 days after the young couple had disappeared, the authorities would find some of Kelly's clothing, and this included her undergarments, scattered along the road, and they had been cut. The police also found rope in the same area, leading them to believe that a sexual assault could have played a role in their disappearance. After extensive searching by many branches of authorities, the couple was still not found. Fast forward 2 months, when a few squirrel hunters would come upon a horrific scene that they were not expecting, which included the remains of a body that would be known as female. Also, why just squirrels? I didn't know that was like a thing. Like, people just go out and hunt squirrels? Do they eat them? Or is it more like of a nuisance thing? Let me know. The very next day, another body would be found. Just 70 feet away from the first body, it would be found that these indeed belonged to Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. Further investigation would find that Kelly's cause of death was unfortunately strangulation, and Tim's would be found to be a couple of stabbings into one of his ribs. Sadly, these murders went cold for years and would be dubbed the Sweetheart murders. After April had learned about the murders, she would say she immediately knew who had committed these murders. April would remember having seen the Concord house before when they lived in the area, and this is when she realized that her father had actually worked there. Edwards had been the handyman at the venue at the time. This is when the picture of April's real childhood started flooding in with memories she didn't even realize at the time were so concerning. One in particular that stood out, the night that her father had come home with the cut on his nose. When the family had packed up and left, Edwards told Kay that the cut was from a fight that he had been in, but when the authorities were there, he had told them that it was from a hunting accident. Edwards apparently talked about the Sweetheart murders obsessively. April was seemingly so taken aback in the moment where she is putting these pieces together that she said at the end of the article about the Sweetheart murders that she was reading, it told her to reach out to a Detective Garcia if anyone had any more information about the murders. So she did. This is when she told authorities that she thought the killer was in fact her father. Can you imagine that phone call? Can you imagine making that phone call? Holy shit. Detective Chad Garcia dug a little further and saw that Edwards was interviewed when the murders had taken place because, of course, he worked at the Concord house, but he would tell authorities that he wasn't actually there on the night that the couple was last seen, which was August 9th. However, Detective Garcia noticed in the notes from the report of the interview that Edwards had a black eye, and what Detective Garcia said was a broken nose, this being the cut on Edwards' nose that April had been referring to. Of course, Edwards told the police that this was from deer hunting. How chilling to look back as a detective and see that this man not only worked there, but also had a beat-up face during his interview, and then moved his family away in the middle of the night. Also, I wonder what Kay thought about her husband telling her that this was from a fight, but then also telling the police that this was from a hunting accident. She didn't find that suspicious. In all of my research, I didn't see a whole lot about Kay. But maybe he had told her that he was going to lie to the cops so that he wouldn't get in trouble for fighting. Who knows? This was actually the first time that the authorities were learning about the fact that Edwards packed up his family and moved spontaneously. This is when Detective Garcia would do a little digging of his own into who was this man, Edward Wayne Edwards. He first bought Edwards' book, The Metamorphosis of a Criminal, and this is when Garcia would notice a profile start to build that included joy in fire and some very obvious mental health issues. In the book, Garcia would figure out that Edwards seems to have in the past abused women, especially young brunettes, just like Kelly Drew from the Sweetheart murders. Garcia would go to meet Edwards, who at this time was living in Kentucky in a trailer park and was over 75 years old and in poor health. You can hear the recorded interview where Detective Garcia is asking if he remembers the young couple or having ever met them. Edwards says no, and then Garcia asks if he remembers ever injuring his nose out there in Wisconsin. This is when Edwards would say that he remembered hurting it somewhere, but he wasn't really specific on where that was. Then Garcia asked Edwards if he ever did any deer hunting while he was out in Wisconsin, and Edwards would say no. Oh boy, here we go. You can tell on the recording that Garcia is trying to be friendly to get the information out of him, like, quote, "So you didn't take advantage of our deer hunting? It's the best deer hunting around," end quote. And again, Edwards replies, no. When asked for DNA at the end of the interview, Edwards says, quote, "I don't know if I'd go for that," end quote. Like, if you're innocent of any crimes, wouldn't you want to clear your name in that crime? This is a huge red flag. So he refused. And then Garcia pulls out of his pocket a DNA search warrant that he had actually gotten before he even headed to Kentucky. I just have to say, as I have watched true crime interviews by the dozens, and also on shows that I like to watch, the balls that these detectives have during the interviews and having to have the awkward conversations with people is just something that it must be really hard and cringy when you know what these fuckers have done. And then you have to put on this facade and have this like fake conversation. That would be really hard. Just saying. Edwards then folds and says, if it's the law, he will, but he doesn't really want to. This is when the authorities would test it against Kelly Drew's underwear where the semen stain was found, and it would be found to be a perfect match. Ed Wayne Edwards was then charged for the murders of Kelly Drew and Timothy Hack. Edwards was extradited to Wisconsin for trial. I guess Edwards at this time was very sick, on oxygen, and his diabetes was really bad, so instead of sitting around in jail waiting to die, Edwards decides that what he really wants is the death penalty, with one problem. Wisconsin is not a state that has the death penalty. This is when Edwards would write to the people in the state of Ohio, which does in fact have the lethal injection, and in a letter says that he has something to tell them that they are going to want to know, basically. Detectives go to Wisconsin for an interview, and you can see some of these online if you're curious. Edwards would tell the tale of what happened to poor Billy, the young man that was helping Edwards build his second family home. Edwards and Billy, who was in his early 20s, or at least in his 20s, were partners in some odd jobs for some time. Edwards would admit that one afternoon he saw Billy playing with April, or like kind of messing around with her, possibly some other kids, and Edwards was worried that Billy had done something to or with his daughter April. Edwards claimed that he had told Billy that if he didn't stop, quote, making eyes and fooling around with my small children and being around them, that he was going to end up getting hurt, end quote. I guess Billy was kind of surprised and was kind of like, what is the problem here? Edwards then confessed he point-blank told Billy he was going to kill him. Edwards somehow got it into his head that Billy had molested April and wanted to put together a plan to take Billy out. One night, while Edwards was at a local pub, he sees Billy with his girlfriend Judy out having drinks. When the couple heads out from the bar, Edwards is right behind them. Billy and Judy were parked at the local, makeout spot or lover's lane, if you will, making out and totally oblivious to any danger near them. Edwards is lurking outside of the car with his shotgun. And when he went up to the couple, he told Judy to stay inside the vehicle and that he was just going to talk to Billy. Edwards claimed that Judy got out of the car anyways and followed Billy. This is when Billy told Edwards there's $500 in the car inside of Judy's purse and just take it if he wanted the money. This is when Edwards shot and killed Billy right there on the spot. Edwards was pissed that Billy had just named him in front of his girlfriend because I guess she didn't know who Edwards was. Then Edwards shoots Judy and it would hit her near the throat area where she died as well. There was no evidence of any molestation and April never knew Billy was actually murdered. So he basically killed this innocent man for no other reason than because he made up a molestation story in his own head and then believed it. So Edwards had assumed if he confessed to these murders in Ohio, then he would receive the death penalty. Unfortunately for him, he would learn that the death penalty was not in Ohio when the murder of Billy and Judy took place. I didn't know that that was a thing. Did you guys? That, the time frame of the murders can affect the sentence? I'll have to look into that more. So Edwards would say that he felt he deserved and wanted the death penalty, but as we know, there are now 4 murders on Edwards, and he will not be getting the death penalty. This makes Edwards confess to yet another murder in hopes of getting what he wants. Edwards would then confess to murdering his own foster son, Danny Boy Edwards. It's so fucking sad. It turns out that back when Danny is going into the military, he has to figure out benefits. And when it comes to the life insurance part, Edwards convinces Danny to pay for the maximum benefits. Edwards confessed his plan the whole time was to actually kill Danny Boy after he was done with boot camp, which is fucking sickening. That poor kid thought this man was taking him in and helping him get his life together and being a father figure. And to Edwards, he was just a pawn or a means to make some money. Gross. When Danny was injured and was about to be discharged from the military, this is when Edwards realized his benefits wouldn't be there if he was discharged. So, Edwards convinces Danny Boy to go AWOL instead and took him out to a spot in the isolated cemetery that Edwards lived by. And of course, with him, Danny Boy had a bag of his belongings. And this is when Edwards admits having asked Danny to grab a cigarette out of his bag for him. Edwards admitted that Danny didn't even know he had a shotgun with him. And then Edwards shot him. Of course, Edwards was then able to claim $250,000 from the insurance. So sad and so unnecessary. Edwards made a deal to confess to this murder, and in 2010, he was sentenced to lethal injection for the charge of murder for Danny Boy Edwards. However, since Edward Wayne Edwards was in such poor health, he would actually die the following year, just 1 month before he was going to be executed. It was speculated that Edwards is responsible for many more murders than his confessions, and there are many that agree. His own daughter, April, not only feels a lot of guilt for having to turn her own father in, but also for things that were out of her control during her childhood. She also speculated that they went on so many family camping trips during their nomadic lifestyle, and a lot of times her father wasn't even there with them. In fact, he wasn't even in the tent with them, or even around, and this, of course, leads April, among most of us, to wonder if he had been out there killing the whole time that he wasn't with his family. One of the books that are out there about Edward Wayne Edwards, the It's Me, goes into how the belief from some is that Edwards was different serial killers that are unknown. For example, he could have been the Zodiac Killer. I saw there is a cold case detective named John Cameron, who is actually also the author of the book It's Me. But there, I guess, is a series called It Was Him, The Many Murders of Ed Edwards, that captures the work of Cameron that he's been putting into collecting information, putting various cases together into context, and he believes that all of them are Edwards. Some of these include John Benet Ramsey, Lacey Peterson, the Black Dahlia murders, the West Memphis 3 murders, and a ton of other famous cases, which to me is yeah, right, it cannot be all one guy. But I would definitely be interested to hear why this cold case detective is dead set on all of them being Edwards for sure. Many people believe Cameron's theories to be outlandish and conspiracy theory-like with wild tales, and while that might be true, there are some interesting facts in some of the claims, like, for example, the Zodiac Killer. Edwards was in the area at the time, and not only did he want to be known and famous for his crimes, but he also killed couples, as the Zodiac did. There seems to be one case that stands out as possibly having some serious hard evidence to link Edwards to a murder, and that is the murder of Larry Payton and Beverly Allen, and this took place in Portland, Oregon, where Edwards had not only been spotted hanging around the scene, but was actually talked to about this murder. It was said that Edwards had a bullet wound in his arm that the authorities thought could be from a bullet hole that they had found in the murdered couple's windshield. The police actually arrested Edwards, but somehow he escaped and fled, and the authorities never pursued him. April has since come out with her own book titled Raised by a Serial Killer, Discovering the Truth About My Father. If you're interested in looking further into this case, there's also a plethora of information and books, some of which will be linked in the show notes. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Edwards that was caught in an interview on camera, and I believe that People Magazine Investigates also closed with it, and it's because it's just such a wild statement, and it shows you exactly who Edward Wayne Edwards was as a person. It's funny, not funny. When Edwards was asked if he ever wanted to offer an apology to the victims' families of the people that he had killed, he responded, quote, "Well, naturally I'm sorry and everything, but if I felt that bad about it, I wouldn't have done it to start with," end quote. If anyone out there has any information that may lead to additional crimes tied to Edward Wayne Edwards, they are encouraged to call 800-FBI-TIPS to share their information. And that, my friends, is the story of Edward Wayne Edwards, father of 5, rapist, serial killer, and just a nasty villain in the lives of the people that he took from this world. This guy's story actually blows my mind, and the fact that he was seemingly like this career criminal, wanting this infamy for it and attention from it, and then after years and years of this, it was just like, okay, I'm done with that now. I'm gonna get married, have a family, and move on to rape and murder. I feel like there's just some huge pieces to this puzzle missing. Like, you don't just progress to murder that way. I'm willing to bet that there were some murders before his longer stint in prison, when he, allegedly turned everything around, but who knows for sure. But there has to be some murders that are unsolved that he was responsible for, like the couple in Ohio that he was actually arrested for. Why the fuck didn't the police pursue him when he fled? Hello? Non-guilty people don't fucking flee. Get his ass. I hate hearing stories where some of the crimes could have been prevented had a few extra steps been taken. It's awful, and I can't help but wonder what else he's done. I don't think he's done as much of what the retired Detective John Cameron thinks that he's done, but I am interested enough to watch the limited series and hear his opinions. I think it's fascinating and entertaining. If you guys know anything more about Edwards or know any online sleuthing theories that people have put together, do share on social media. I hope you guys enjoyed this case as much as I did, and I hope to see you guys next week for another case here on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Alright guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help The Kill File and other true crime lovers find us. Also, check out the website at thekillfile.com to suggest a case. Find our merch shop for fun Kill File gear, which you can also find at thekillfile.printify.me and help support the podcast. Have a suggestion or want to share your own true crime stories? Email thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com for a chance to get them read on the podcast. Follow The Kill File on your favorite social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue X, TikTok, and of course, you can subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. We are either listed as The Kill File or The Kill File Podcast. Come on back Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case here on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.